Hello and welcome to the video. This is an introduction to something called Crossfire. Now, if you are a new pilot to Crossfire and you're not sure how to set it up and what the steps are, then this video is going to be definitely the one you're going to want to watch. It's got all the tips and tricks and the basics. Now, I have a complete Crossfire series that talks all about how you set Crossfire up and goes through it in far more detail. And this video is not a replacement for actually just sitting and reading the manual, because there's an awful lot of good information in there and it's been updated all the time. But if you are looking to add Crossfire onto something like a multi-rotor, there's my Crossfire antenna on this armor tank quad, or you want to put it in something like a flying wing or a fixed wing model, here's the antenna in this ZOHD Dart that I've got a flight controller in. Then I'll kind of go through the basics in this and talk through the gotchas. I've been flying with Crossfire for quite a long time, and there's a standard process you go through to set it all up. So if you don't know your CRSFs from your SBUS, if you don't know the differences of how you set stuff up and antenna alignment and that kind of stuff, and what you do when you take the thing out of the box for the very first time, this is going to go through each of those steps at a reasonable pace. Time codes below so that you can follow along, and hopefully by watching this you'll get kind of an introduction to 101 level of what you need to know about Crossfire. So the very first thing that you need to do when you get your Crossfire module, and the Crossfire modules come in lots of different shapes and sizes, is to plug it into the computer and update the firmware to make sure you're using the latest and greatest. Now, the way to do that is to download Agent X. TBS use this software to update all of their technology, whether or not it's one of their radios, one of their FPV systems, things like Crossfire. And having Agent X on your computer makes it super duper easy. So link in the description, go and download it, install it onto your computer, and then plug in your Crossfire module. Always remember to make sure your antennas are installed before you plug anything in, and plug it into your computer and it will be automatically found. Go into there, go into the firmware, and then select update and let it go through the process. It's completely automatic, and it means that when the Crossfire connects to the receiver for the first time, it'll also update all the firmware automatically on those receivers too, which is quite a clever little trick. So now we've got the module updated, next job is to install it into the radio and configure it. Now, the radio is obviously going to have some kind of JR bay at the back. This just happens to be a Radio Master TX16S, but anything like this is going to work. Now, the only thing you have to be careful of is, unfortunately, FreeSky radios, they install a slow inverter for the JR bay at the back, so that you can't run these modules at full speed. However, in the box that you get with your Crossfire module, there is a little adapter that you can wire in alongside that inverter to basically take care of that. So if you have a FreeSky radio, do check the documentation on the TBS website. I'll put a link down below on how you install that inverter. The little board is needs about 4 or 5 wires. It's a little bit fiddly, but unfortunately it's one of those daft things that FreeSky do. However, this Radio Master is going to run at full speed, so all we need to do is just plug the Crossfire module into the back and it'll snap in place, and then we're going to turn the radio on with Crossfire for the first time. Now, if it's a module like this where you don't have the antenna on all the time and you can remove it, do make sure that the antenna is installed before you power it for the first time. Now, the Crossfire technology is actually pretty robust. You can power it for quite a while and forget to put your antenna on before it will fry the output electronics. But it's just good experience to always make sure the antenna is installed. And these later versions of the Crossfire module absolutely have it, so you can't take them off. So let's power up the radio. And the first thing we need to do is to select CRSF as the protocol, the language that the radio is going to talk to the module. So make sure that on external RF you have CRSF selected, and if you do, then you should see the light is pulsing at the back, and the radio can then talk bidirectionally to the module, and you can set everything up. So let's just exit out of that. Now, By default, the Lua scripts on the radio that you need to do everything with Crossfire have been a standard part of the SD card image for OpenTX for a very long time. But on modern radios like this, if you press the radio button, so you're in the radio menus, you have first of all this tools screen, and number 4 is configure Crossfire. If you didn't have that, then you could navigate into the scripts directory on the SD card, go down into tools, and then select Crossfire. But let's use the new way. So let me just zoom in a little bit to make it easier to see what I'm doing. So hopefully that's a little bit easier to read now zoomed in. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down here and say Crossfire configure, hit select, and it gives us all of the devices that it can see. Now when we're bound to a receiver, the receiver that we're also connected to will appear on here as well, but for now we just have the Crossfire micro transmitter, which is what we've got plugged in the back of this particular radio, and also the ability to set up Crossfire Wi-Fi, which I will do in the next video in the series. For now, let's worry about Crossfire Micro TX. We'll hit enter on the radio, and it will read all of the data off the Crossfire module. Now, on here we have the set failsafe, and we'll come back to that to talk about how you set failsafe. What you do is you just move all the sticks and controls into the position that you want, and then click set failsafe, and it will save that on the receiver. Bind is going to be used for bind, surprise, surprise. And then under general, there's quite a few things under here. Now, region, you can set the different region, and that will also limit your power levels for the area that you're in. You can set your max power level, and if you set your region, it will automatically set your maximum power level for whichever region you are in. You can set up dynamic power, whether that's on or off, and that will mean that the further away that the model gets, the more power will be used to try and maintain the connection. And then there's the frequency. Now this confuses a lot of people. There are 2 versions of frequency that you can use, or 2 frequencies. One is 868. If I hit enter, I can also choose 915. If you're in Europe, go for 868. If you're in America, go 915. I'm in Europe, so I'm going to go for 868 megahertz. So there we have it. At the moment, I'm running version 3.75 of the firmware. On an older version, I couldn't get this to work on this particular radio. So if you're ever having problems, the first thing to do is to update your Crossfire module with the latest, greatest and version. So now we've got all that set, let me grab a receiver and let's go through the process of how you bind a receiver, because not only will it bind it, it'll also update everything on the receiver as well, so it's got the latest and greatest firmware. So the most common receiver that you're going to come across these days for something like a multi-rotor is one of these little things. It has an Immortal T antenna installed on this one, and by default you'll find that only 4 of the pins are used at the end. There are some extra ones. Now the nice thing about Crossfire receivers is that you can decide what each of the outputs on the receiver does, and by default you can set it up for things like SBUS or things like CRSF. That same protocol that the radio talks to the module, you can also have the receiver talking to a flight controller running something like Betaflight or something like iNav. Now just having the 3 wires here that I've got set up on this one, I can set this up for SBUS, so that means that you can use a Crossfire receiver with any kind of flight controller that understands SBUS if it doesn't understand CRSF. So let's bind this and set it up and show you how to do all that. So we're going to power the receiver first of all. Now we've got a nice red light on it. We'll use a slightly different radio for this little bit, just because in case you don't have that other radio that I'm playing with. So let's power this up.
OpenTX.
Hopefully you can see this is the larger version of the Crossfire system. It's connected to the receiver. This has already been bound before, and that's why we've got this nice light. This bigger version also has the screen on the back, so you don't need to use the Lua script, but let's do that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to hold the menu page. I'm going to page across until I find the SD card contents. In this particular version, there's a Crossfire directory. I'm going to find the Crossfire Lua script, press and hold enter, and say execute. Now, you can see here that we have both the transmitter and the nano receiver, because they've been bound before. And you can see it's all bound because not only is it all nice and green on the back, but it's all nice and green on the receiver as well. So what we'll do is we'll show you how to rebind it. So of course in here, just like we were looking at last time, we have the option to go into binding. So what we're going to do is, with it all powered up, we're going to press binding, and it says binding. See, the little receiver light has gone red because it's not talking to it anymore. And all you do is, there's a little button on the receiver. You just press that and it will flash. Telemetry recovered. And then we have it all rebound. If it's not working, just unplug the power and replug the power in. And there we go. We can see on the screen it says binding OK. Now, if an update was needed, it would have automatically prompted me, do you want to update? If it ever does that, I'd always say yes. Older versions of the receiver, you had to kind of press the button. Modern versions of the receiver with software that's been around for quite a while now will automatically update, and you'll get the latest and greatest firmware on your receiver without having to plug anything in. Now, if we come out of there, so there we can see we've got the Crossfire transmitter. We can now see the Crossfire Nano. If we press enter on there, then what it's going to do is it's going to read all the configuration information from the receiver, and we can configure it here on the radio, just like we can on anything else. So we can see we've got 12 channel mode, the telemetry is turned on, we've got all the fail-safe settings, so we can have it as cut, or we can have it as fail-safe position. If you're going to put it in something like a multi-rotor, personally I'd put it as cut. The flight controller is going to see either over SBUS or CRSF that there's a problem anyway, but if it's cut, the flight controller absolutely knows that something horrible has happened. If you're going to put it in something like a plane, I would probably set fail-safe position here and then set the fail-safe manually in a moment. I'll show you how to do that. And then what we have here is we actually have the output map of what all of the different channels on the radio do. Now by default, with this wide as it is with the 3 cables, I've just set my first output to be SBUS, and that means that this is going to output SBUS, the same SBUS that everybody else uses. So you just plug this into your SBUS inputs on your flight controller and you're good. It's that easy. However, you can also set it up for CRSF. So what we do is we move around. You can see there's loads and loads of different options in here, and just go through until you find CRSF. So there we go, CRSF transmit, and it'll automatically populate the second one as CRSF receive, and that is live updated onto the receiver. You don't have to press save or do anything else. And with it set like that, then we can use CRSF with a flight controller, and that will also send back all the telemetry stuff as well. Last tip while we're looking at this, let's finish off by looking at the fail-safe stuff. So say for example, let's say we were going to use it in a plane and we wanted fail-safe position. Let's exit out of that. We go into the transmitter. We can have this top selection here that says set fail-safe. So say for example, we wanted the throttle at the low position, all the channels in the default position. I don't know, maybe we wanted flaps down or whatever it is that you have set on your radio. Then you just hit enter and the fail-safe is set. If the link is lost between the radio and the receiver, then those channel positions will be sent over the SBUS or CRSF, if you've got that set, to the flight controller. However, like I said, I would use that for something like a plane, or I would use cut if it's going to be in something like a multi-rotor with a flight controller that knows what to do. So let's talk now a little bit about what you do at the other end. So here we are in Betaflight, but it's the same for iNav2. Now, because I've set my receiver up initially as SBUS, so the first output is set as SBUS and there's just a standard 3-pin cable connected, then the SBUS configuration in Betaflight is identical to every SBUS receiver you've ever seen. i.e. in ports, there is the serial receiver turned on for one spare UART, and then in configuration you configure a serial receiver as SBUS. And that's all there is to it. However, If you are going to use CRSF, and I would strongly recommend that you do, because CRSF is an awful lot faster, and it's also bidirectional too, so you'll get your telemetry back down to your radio over the same link, then it's exactly the same setup with one small difference. So again, in the ports tab, you're going to need to find a spare UART that you can enable as your serial receiver, and then you're going to have to wire up those two outputs. If you remember, on the radio there was a CRSF transmit and a CRSF receive. You're going to have to connect those two outputs to the receive and transmit pins on that UART on the flight controller. And that is the old difference that you need to do in terms of the wiring. Everything else is very similar. So once you've got that set up, come here into configuration, scroll down until you get to the serial receiver again. This time what we're going to do is, rather than have SBUS, we will select CRSF. The other thing I'd heartily recommend is, if you're going to have CRSF, make sure that you've got telemetry turned on. Then Betaflight and iNav and others will automatically know that you want the telemetry sending back to your radio. And it's that easy. Really simple to set up and very simple to configure. So there we have it. That's most of the basics that you need to know in order to get your new Crossfire system up and running. However, there is one last thing that I see a lot of confusion about, and that is about antenna alignment. Now, the way the antennas are set is that they are essentially a linear antenna, and the best possible signal is when they're perfectly aligned. The more out of alignment that you get, the worse the signal. And this is further complicated by the fact that on quadcopters, you'll regularly see the antenna like this, which is where it's mounted horizontally somewhere on the craft, and on a lot of fixed wing models you'll see them mounted vertically like this. In fact, the other side of it sticks out the bottom. Hopefully you can see that there. And the reason for this is that on something like a fixed wing, if you mounted it horizontally, then what happens is, the way the antennas actually work is the ends of the antennas don't radiate a lot of signal or don't receive a lot of signal. So if you are actually looking at the end of the antenna like that, that is the worst case scenario. If you have the antenna flat on a wing and it's flying around, and then you have it flying around you, then the null, or the end of the antenna, is pointing directly at your antenna or vice versa. So it isn't great, which is why you'll see the vast majority of pilots, including myself, will mount them vertically. And then on the radio, we'll also mount the other antenna vertically, so that as they're flying around, even if I roll and tilt about, I'm still getting a really good signal. The thing on a quadcopter is the quadcopter typically isn't going to be flown anywhere near as far away, so not as big a deal, even with the less sensitivity that you're getting off the end of these little antennas that are mounted horizontally. You're still going to have more than enough signal to maintain a really good connection. On 25 milliwatts on Crossfire, you know, you're going to get 3-4 kilometers in ideal conditions. So you're not going to be flying something like this in a race anywhere near that far away. Lots of places it isn't legal to do that anyway. So the fact that you may occasionally have the quadcopter moving around and the end of the antenna pointing towards your radio, you know what, you don't really matter. There is one other kind of antenna. This is the Immortal T that I'm kind of talking about a lot now. There is this other kind of antenna, which is the default one, which comes in a lot of the kits. Now this is just literally 2 bits of wire. Most pilots would mount them in this configuration, in kind of a 90 degrees in a V like this, or potentially that way round. And the idea is that if the antenna on your radio is vertical and you have this in front, then as the model rolls around, one of the lobes or one of the sides of the antenna is actually coming into alignment with the antenna on your radio and giving you a great bit of reception. So be really careful about how you install your antenna onto the model. Installing it into a wing or a flying model, I would personally always go for mount it vertically. It just works so much better, and have the antenna vertical on your radio. If you're flying something like a quadcopter where there isn't the space to mount it vertically, and that's usually the case, then you know what, don't worry about that. Just mount it horizontally, put the antenna horizontal on your radio as well, and with the much closer in distances, you should still have plenty of signal to fly around. So that's covered all the main basics really. Stay tuned, there will be another follow-up video that will go into a little bit more depth on some of the more wacky cool stuff that Crossfire does. But if you're new to Crossfire, that's now, you've unpacked it, you've updated it, you've bound your receiver, you've installed your receiver into your model, and you know how to mount your antenna and set your failsafe as well. Thank you for watching my video and watching right to the very end. If you want to find out what I'm currently working on, you can follow me on social media by searching for Painless360 in the usual places. If you'd like to become part of the inner circle, then you can become a Patreon. Details are in the description and you get lots of additional benefits. Check out the playlist section on the channel too. I organise all of my videos into playlists, and it's called something like Introduction to or for Beginners. All of the content is aimed so that you can start at the very beginning, and it teaches you that subject, starting with simple principles and moving up to teach you everything you need to know.